Thank you for this wonderful organization and the pre-party we had before. And it's wonderful to be here back again. So let me immediately jump into that. The musical metaphor is common in the description of life, so it doesn't come as a surprise that also von Uexküll made use of it. For him, it is the conformity to a plan, Planmäßigkeit, that ensures the perfect complementarity between different organisms and their Umwelten, and it allows the whole system to function like a colossal orchestra. Here, where the instruments are possibly attuned to each other by virtue not only of the respective tones they emit, but also of the manner of their entire construction. So before diving into this insightful analogy, we would like to warn against a possible reductionist interpretation of the complete score lying on the conductor's desk. Unfortunately, in spite of all warnings against reductionism, including those by von Uexküll, such interpretations prevailed, and even the discovery of the double helix was presented and perceived as the discovery of the score of life, which, of course, encountered also had continuations, giving rise to even more daring hypotheses like that of Dawkins, that was tantamount to claiming that it is the selfish scores that create the musicians to ensure their own reproduction, which, of course, encountered due reaction by biologists like Dennis Noble, who, not coincidentally, also made use of the musical metaphor, but in a way that is not so prone to reductionist and genocentric interpretation. The music of life plays itself without a conductor, and let's add also without a predefined score. So let's see how the emphasis shifted along a specific thread of 20th century philosophical discourse on biology. First, von Uexküll with his focus on Planmäßigkeit and Umwelt. Then neurologist and psychiatrist Goldstein, who was inspired by Uexküll, yet also criticized him for his strict adherence to Planmäßigkeit, and he emphasized the agency of the organism. Then physician and philosopher Kang Riem, who encountered Uexküll via Goldstein, he defined health as generation of the norm rather than norm seeking. Next, mention Merleau-Ponty, who developed an interest in biology in his later career and was influenced definitely by Uexküll and shifted his focus from phenomenology to ontogenesis. And last, I won't mention Gilbert Simondon, student of the last two, who continued from Merleau-Ponty's ontogenetic approach and developed an all-embracing relational ontogenetic framework, the so-called theory of individuation. Just a second. Let's have a look at that. Theory of individuation is a scientifically and surprisingly also technologically inspired philosophical framework. Simondon puts at the beginning of any process of individuation what he calls the pre-individual being. This is inspired by Anaximander's apeiron, actually. It is pure potentiality, a conflict-laden state, and therefore metastable. To explain this process, he makes use of a well-studied physical phenomenon, namely of crystallization, but please note, as a metaphor. So let the supersaturated solution represent the pre-individual being, which is pure potentiality. There are conflicts. What kind of conflicts? Let me name one. For example, from which point will the process start. So upon a slight perturbation, which may be just a grain of sand or so, the whole process is unleashed. The symmetries between conflicting alternatives are broken. So conflict resolution already reminds us of meaning making. Kalevi cited from Yuri Lotman, I think. And that gives rise to the emergence of individual, as Simondon defines it. Individual is not an isolated being, as typically the word associates, but it is a mediating relation between disparate orders of magnitude at the same time. In this specific case, the disparate orders are the molecular order level of order and the macro scale of the flask. So this process gives rise not only to individuals, but also the associated milieu, as Simondon calls it, different phases, emergence of structures, and most importantly, emergence of relationality. Well, in this physical example, we know how it ends. If you let it go, we arrive at a stable system consisting of a liquid and a solid crystal. I want to remind you of one thing which is important for Simondon, is to try to understand the individual by analyzing the process of individuation and not vice versa, which is often done in what he criticizes. So this particular end, where the initial potential is completely exhausted, to put it in Simondon's word, the pre-individual charge is exhausted. It's peculiar to that kind of relaxation process, a physical process. But in order to account for all possible cases of individuation in different domains, Simondon introduces three distinct modes of individuation of the same process, rather than domains of different scientific disciplines. The physical mode, as we have seen, exhausts the pre-individual potential and arrives at a stable state, so metastability decreases and is exhausted finally. The vital mode, unlike one might perhaps expect, is actually what intervenes into the physical mode and delays its completion, the exhaustion of the pre-individual charge. Therefore, metastability is partially conserved. The psychocollective mode is the continuation of the vital mode in living beings that are complex enough to have psychic and inseparably collective activity, leading to even increase of metastability. Now, if you look at the crystal during its growth, let's say, it's only the surface that is active. The inside does not participate in the mediation process. So in that sense, Simondon emphasizes that in case of the physical individuation, the interior is not really genuine. As opposed to that, individuals generated and maintained by the vital or psychocollective modes are a theater of individuation with a genuine resonance-based interior that he says all parts of a living being is contemporary to the whole. Everything is constantly trying to attune itself to the rest, everything to each other. That's what he calls a more complete regime of internal resonance, more than we have in the physical case where the interior doesn't participate. So, to clarify this notion, I propose to have a glance at a resonance-based interior. somewhere in Istanbul, the trio of my co-author playing. I hope we can get some sound. Soon a friend of theirs is going to join the band. So the internal resonance for the first time, without rehearsal, without obviously scores. And as you will see, how they will start listening to each other, trying to attune themselves to each other at multiple levels. So they are already in resonance. You see that the resonance is really at multiple levels, not only music, but also in an embodied form. And they tune the melody. Vefa takes a sip from his raki to tune himself psychologically and bodily for the process of tuning and attuning. The instruments are tuned, the rhythm is tuned, and on goes the resonance. This is a bar, and next to a street over there, people are really passing by, as you will see soon, and they temporarily sometimes join the internal resonance, whereas people sitting inside, probably also paying something, people who are part of the physical interior are not part of the resonance-based interior. And the musicians, as you see, are not only resonating in the melody, but in a very apparent, embodied manner. So, after this glance at a human scale example of internal resonance and tuning of the instruments at multiple levels, let us return to Uexküll's concern about instruments of life and their tuning. At the most fundamental level, life's instruments consist of biomolecular structures which are formed via phase separation and phase tuning. These phenomena are, at the moment, subject of very vibrant research, particularly accelerating within the last decade. Brangwyn, one of his pioneers actually, together with his colleague Weber, has proposed an analogy between the phases of non-biological molecules and intracellular biomolecules. Of course, the intercellular biomolecules are in a fluidic environment, that's clear, but they can exhibit different behaviors that can be considered as analogous to non-biological molecules in the three basic phases. So, soluble molecules without a supramolecular structure, analogous to the gaseous state phase, physiological granules, analogous to liquids, serving some functionality within the cell as membraneless organelles, and rigid aggregates, which are best known in the context of lethal diseases, correspond to the solid case. Lethal diseases such as prion diseases, for example, most known as Jakob disease, the so-called mad cow disease, where the proteins are folded attain the most stable 3D conformation, which is so rigid that it cannot support life. But we encounter them also in other neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. And they are also found partially in systemic diseases like diabetes and cancer. This actually reminds us of something that once used to be quite fashionable. Remember the edge of chaos hypothesis, with its claim that lifelike behavior occurs at the edge of chaos, that is, in the complexity zone between chaos and rigid order, but closer to the chaotic edge. The name was coined by Norman Packard in 1988. Unfortunately, it was overgeneralized and inflated in the 90s. It is actually a very intuitive and powerful metaphor, but somewhat lacks philosophical grounding and therefore also criteria to apply it to properly to different contexts. So let's try to provide this grounding. Without referring, though, to an ambiguous term like order with all its 19th century baggage. From a Simondonian perspective, we would say the stable aggregates are outcomes of irreversible processes, physical mode that exhausts the pre-individual charge. The physiological ones correspond to metastable structures maintained by the reversible process of vital individuation. Soluble molecules, since they have no supramolecular structure, can be said to not to be individuated at that level. Of course, they are individuated, but not at supramolecular level. Okay, so we can say that there is a relation between the phase of a structure and, let's say, supramolecular structure and the mode of individuation that generates it. Moreover, it's indicated in this rather recent article, there is a relation also between the functionality of these condensates and its phase. All right, so that allows us also to conclude that there must be a relation between functionality and the mode of individuation. Right, but let's go back to this claim. If different phases have different functionalities, how does it fit in with this classification, which only allows actually the liquid-like state as the healthy functional one? So is it really correct to claim that only liquid-like phase can provide healthy functionality? I will just give a single counterexample about prions, namely recent research, well, since more than a decade actually, results obtained in the field demonstrates that prion proteins in their most stable crystal-like conformation serve a very important function in long-term memory formation, where exactly this rigidity is needed. So we can conclude that health or pathology depends on whatever needed contextually and not directly on the phase. Therefore, we have to correct this classification and express it in from a more Simondonian perspective. In the living individual, the mode of individuation is tuned in accordance with the context, the needs of the context, thus providing appropriate functionality. What's also worth indicating is that the alternatives for biomolecules, the phase alternatives, are not just these three. There is a richer palette of alternatives. What else needs to be indicated? Yes, these phases are tuned by changing in a feedback-based manner, so feedback-based regulation of various contextual variables like pH level or concentration of some ingredients, ionic strength, etc. And this phase tuning can occur both in a passive manner, as we have seen in the crystallization and relaxation process, or as an active process. In this example, you see also the third alternative in this case, where it is actively maintained, the condensate, by burning ATP. Okay. So after having looked at the supramolecular structures, let's focus on the biomolecules themselves. Classical, for example, proteins. Classical biology used to present proteins as having a single, stable, well-defined 3D conformation. Yet, recently it turned out that some proteins constantly switch between various conformations, and there are even more common proteins which have specific limited regions exhibiting this behavior. Now look at this figure. On one side, you have the ordered proteins, then in the second column, partially disordered proteins and completely disordered proteins. And let's try to focus on how they respond to different levels of contextual complexity, increasing level of complexity in the vertical axis. The shadow-like figures in the back show the alternating conformations. Now, the first column, which disordered, completely ordered proteins, they don't change their behavior qualitatively, no matter how the complexity of the environment changes. In the other extreme, the completely disordered ones also do not exhibit qualitative changes in response to complexity increase. They are wiggling and jiggling anyway. But the ones in the middle, the partially disordered ones, exhibit a qualitative difference. If the complexity is low, they are well behaved. As the complexity increases, they start this chaotic behavior. So, hence the title. Intrinsically disordered regions are posed to act as sensors of cellular chemistry, sensors of the complexity. So they can serve as sensors, if you wish, as signs about the complexity. Which reminds us of Pate's often quoted question, which is so significant for biosemiotics. So, to conclude the story altogether, the biomolecules constitute a rich arsenal of context-sensitive instruments which are coupled to each other and to higher organizational levels and kept in tune by an ongoing multi-level negotiation process, which is exactly what Simondon calls the internal resonance. It is this internal resonance that generates as a byproduct eventually harmony and eventually even the scores as emergent phenomena. And referring back to Uexküll's paragraph, we see how the functional and structural attuning of the instruments are inseparable. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
The vital mode. Okay. First of all, as I indicated, Simondon does not want to separate the whole knowledge space into distinct scientific disciplines, but he just wants to characterize all of the individuation processes in a single explanation, but to do so, of course, different modes are needed. So living beings, of course, also harbor in themselves physical processes, but additional to that, mechanisms that somewhat apply a brake on these processes and delay, postpone the completion of the process, that is exhaustion of all potentials. And that's what he calls vital individuation process. the vital mode. Welcome.
I think you and Simondonian have solved the, is it turtles or bushes that go all the way down?
Yes,
Somewhere, but nowhere. And
yes, yes, yes,
Thank you.
yes, yes. Thank you for this comment. I suppose you were going to say something, or no? I thought you raised your hand.
I wonder, can it be that all proteins basically are in such a way in a cell? Because I don't know, whether you know how they study it. I don't.
I don't either.
At a certain moment, will collapse this amount of information, and then you think there exists a limit, right? Then, so can it be that?
I mean, I'm just an engineer, but by logical extension, I would say most probably all of them possess larger or smaller domains which are intrinsically disordered. That's what I guess.